The idea didn't come to him suddenly. It had been sitting in the back of his mind for weeks, maybe even months, quietly growing every time he heard another story about betrayal, dishonesty, or someone taking advantage of trust. As a self-made millionaire, he had built his life on discipline, sharp judgment, and a firm belief that people often reveal their true nature when no one is watching. He had seen business partners walk away with more than their share, employees cut corners when supervision slipped, and even close acquaintances justify small acts of dishonesty as harmless. Over time, these experiences shaped the way he looked at people. He didn't just listen to what they said. He watched what they did, especially in moments when they thought their actions would go unnoticed. That belief led him to a quiet decision, one he didn't share with anyone. Not with his friends, not with his colleagues, and certainly not with the person he was about to test. It was a simple idea on the surface, almost too simple. He would leave his safe open. Inside it, there would be stacks of cash, neatly arranged, along with a few pieces of expensive jewelry and important documents. Nothing staged or exaggerated. Just real wealth, sitting there in plain view, waiting to be discovered. He wanted the situation to feel natural, not forced. No dramatic setup, no hidden messages. Just an opportunity placed quietly in someone's path. But this wasn't just about curiosity. For him, it was about confirmation. He believed that true character isn't shown through words or appearances, but through choices made in private moments. When there's no pressure, no audience, and no immediate consequence, that's when a person's real values come forward. That was the moment he wanted to create. He chose a day carefully, making sure his routine would seem normal. He went about his morning as he always did, speaking briefly to the staff, checking a few emails, and moving through his home with the calm confidence of someone in control of every detail. Then, without drawing attention, he walked into his study where the safe was kept. He opened it slowly, as he had done countless times before, but this time, he didn't close it. He left the heavy door slightly ajar, enough for anyone passing by to notice what was inside. The contents were clearly visible. Bundles of cash stacked with precision, their edges aligned. A watch placed carefully in a velvet box. A few gold pieces catching just enough light to draw the eye. It wasn't messy or chaotic. It was deliberate, almost inviting. After setting everything in place, he paused for a moment, looking at the open safe as if trying to predict the future. There were no cameras hidden in the room, no recording devices, no traps. He didn't want evidence. He wanted truth. Quiet, unfiltered truth. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the door open behind him. As he stepped out of the study, his expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. To anyone watching, it would seem like just another ordinary day. But in his mind, something had shifted. He had set a test into motion, one that relied entirely on chance and choice. He didn't know exactly when the moment would come or how it would unfold. He only knew that at some point, someone would walk into that room, notice the open safe, and face a decision that couldn't be undone. She had been working in his house for years, yet somehow, she remained almost invisible to him. Not because she didn't do her job well, but because she did it quietly, without drawing attention. She arrived on time every day, followed her routine with care, and left without expecting recognition. Her presence was steady, predictable, and easy to overlook. In a house filled with expensive furniture, polished floors, and carefully chosen decor, she moved like part of the background, blending into the rhythm of the place without disrupting it. He knew her name, of course, but that was where his knowledge seemed to stop. He had never asked much about her life, never felt the need to understand who she was beyond her role. To him, she was simply the maid, someone hired to clean, organize, and maintain order. Replaceable, like any other employee. But if anyone had taken the time to watch her closely, they would have noticed the small details that quietly revealed her character. The way she handled delicate items with extra care, as if they carried more than just monetary value. The way she returned things to their exact place, not out of fear of being corrected, but out of respect for the space she worked in. She didn't rush through her tasks just to finish early. She paid attention, even when no one was around to notice. Her honesty had never been tested in any obvious way, but it showed itself in small, consistent actions. If she found loose change on the floor, she would place it neatly on a nearby table instead of slipping it into her pocket. If something seemed out of place, she would fix it without being asked. There was a quiet sense of responsibility in everything she did, something that didn't need words or praise. Outside of work, her life was simple, far removed from the luxury of the house she cleaned. She lived in a modest neighborhood where every expense mattered and every decision carried weight. Money was not something she took lightly, and the idea of waste or dishonesty didn't fit into the way she had been raised. She had learned early on that integrity wasn't about what you could get away with, but about what you chose to do when no one was there to stop you. Those lessons stayed with her, shaping her behavior in ways that others might not immediately see. Despite this, she never spoke about her values or tried to present herself as morally superior. She simply lived by them, quietly and consistently. In the millionaire's eyes, none of this stood out. He didn't notice the pattern in her actions or the consistency in her behavior. To him, she was just doing her job, nothing more. He assumed that, like many others, her actions were guided by circumstance rather than principle. He believed that given the right situation, anyone could be tempted, that honesty was often conditional, depending on the risk and the reward. That belief is what made her the perfect subject for his test, even if he didn't realize it. She had never given him a reason to doubt her, but she had also never been placed in a situation where her integrity would be truly challenged. That was about to change. On that particular day, she arrived as usual, unaware that anything was different. She greeted the other staff members softly and began her work without hesitation. Room by room, she moved through the house, cleaning, organizing, and restoring order with the same quiet focus she always had. There was no sign in her expression that she expected anything unusual, no hint that her routine would soon be interrupted by something that could test everything she believed in. She approached each task with the same calm mindset, unaware that just a few steps ahead, a situation was waiting that would force her to make a choice unlike any she had faced before it happened in the middle of her routine, at a point in the day that usually passed without anything worth remembering. She had already cleaned several rooms, moving steadily from one space to another, following the same order she had memorized over time. There was a rhythm to her work, a quiet flow that made each task feel natural. Dusting, arranging, wiping surfaces, checking corners, everything done with care and attention. When she reached the study, nothing about the closed door suggested anything unusual. It was just another room on her list, another space that needed to be cleaned before she moved on. She opened the door gently, as she always did, careful not to disturb anything inside. At first, her eyes moved automatically, scanning the room the way they always did, taking in the desk, the shelves, the chairs, the faint layer of dust that needed to be cleared. But then something caught her attention, something that didn't fit the usual order of things. The safe. It was open, not wide open, but enough to break the pattern she was used to seeing. She paused without realizing it, her hand still resting lightly on the door as her eyes fixed on that small, unusual detail. For a moment, she didn't move. The sight didn't immediately register as an opportunity. It registered as a mistake, something that wasn't supposed to happen. She took a step closer, slowly, almost cautiously, as if approaching something fragile. The room was quiet, and in that silence, the open safe seemed louder than anything else. As she drew nearer, the contents became clear. Stacks of cash, arranged neatly. Jewelry placed carefully inside. Items that didn't just suggest wealth, but confirmed it in a way that was impossible to ignore. The kind of things most people only saw in passing, locked away, protected, distant. Now they were right there, within reach. Her breathing shifted slightly, not in panic, but in awareness. This was not something she had ever encountered before. Not like this. She stood there for a few seconds, her mind trying to process what she was seeing. Questions began to form, simple but important. Why was it open? Had someone forgotten to close it? Was the owner aware of this? She glanced around the room instinctively, as if expecting someone to walk in and explain the situation. But no one came. The house remained quiet, undisturbed. She looked back at the safe, this time with more focus. The details stood out more clearly now. The texture of the cash bundles, the subtle shine of gold, the careful arrangement that suggested intention, not carelessness. It didn't look like something that had been left open by accident. It looked deliberate. That thought lingered for a moment, creating a slight tension in her mind. But even as it crossed her thoughts, she didn't jump to conclusions. She wasn't someone who assumed the worst or rushed into decisions. Instead, she stood still, letting the moment settle, allowing herself to fully understand what was in front of her. Her hands remained at her sides. She didn't reach out, didn't touch anything. There was a distance she maintained, not just physically, but mentally, as if crossing that invisible line would change something important. The room felt different now, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with the objects inside it. It wasn't just a room anymore. It was a moment, a situation that required awareness. Her routine had been interrupted, replaced by something that demanded a choice. She could feel that, even if she couldn't fully explain it. Another glance around the room confirmed what she already knew. She was alone. No footsteps in the hallway. No voices nearby. Just silence and the open safe. The kind of silence that makes every second feel longer than it actually is. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, not out of fear, but out of focus. This wasn't just about what she had found. It was about what came next. The decision wasn't forced. There was no urgency pressing her to act immediately. And yet, the weight of the moment was clear. Whatever she chose to do would come from her alone, without influence, without guidance, without anyone there to tell her what was right or wrong. The moment stretched quietly, giving her more time than she expected, yet somehow making every second feel heavier. She stood in front of the open safe, fully aware that whatever she did next would come from her own decision, not from pressure or instruction. Her eyes rested on the contents again, not with curiosity anymore, but with a kind of careful attention. The reality of the situation had settled in. This wasn't something accidental she could simply ignore without thought. It required a response, even if that response was silence. Her first instinct wasn't to reach forward, but to step back slightly, creating space between herself and what was inside. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but it reflected something deeper. A boundary, not one placed by rules or supervision, but one she carried within herself. She had been raised to respect what wasn't hers, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a belief that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how easy it might seem in the moment. Still, she didn't rush away. She stayed there, thinking. Not in a dramatic way, not overwhelmed, but grounded. She considered the situation carefully. Someone had left the safe open. That meant something valuable was exposed. Whether it was a mistake or intentional didn't change one fact in her mind. It wasn't hers. That thought was simple, clear, and steady. It didn't need to be argued or justified. It just existed as truth for her. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the door, as if checking again whether anyone might walk in. The silence remained unchanged. There was no sign of movement in the hallway, no sound that suggested she was being watched or expected. She was completely alone with the decision. For many people, this kind of moment might invite temptation, a quiet voice suggesting that no one would know, that something small wouldn't matter. But for her, that voice never fully formed. Not because she was unaware of the value in front of her, but because her thinking didn't work that way. She didn't measure actions by what she could get away with. She measured them by what felt right, even when no one else was present to see it. She took another slow breath, her expression calm, her posture steady. Then, with deliberate care, she moved closer to the safe again, but not to take anything. Her hand reached toward the heavy door, fingers resting lightly against the cold metal. For a brief moment, she paused, as if making sure of her decision, even though it had already been made internally. There was no hesitation in her values, only in the physical act itself, as if she wanted to carry it out with the same care she gave to everything else. She gently pushed the door, closing it with quiet precision. The sound was soft, almost unnoticeable, but in that moment, it felt significant. Not dramatic, not loud, just final. She didn't rush after that. She stood still for a second, her eyes resting on the now closed safe, as if confirming that things had been restored to how they should be. Then she turned away, her focus returning to her work. There was no sign of pride in her expression, no sense of having done something extraordinary. To her, this wasn't a grand act. It was simply the right thing to do. She picked up her cleaning cloth again and continued with the task she had started, wiping down surfaces, adjusting items on the desk, moving through the room with the same quiet attention as before. If anything, her movements became even more precise, as if the moment had sharpened her focus rather than distracted her. There was no need for her to mention what she had seen, no urgency to report it immediately, no expectation of recognition. She carried on as if nothing unusual had happened, not because it meant nothing, but because her decision didn't depend on being acknowledged. It existed on its own, complete and settled within her, guiding her actions without needing validation. He had been waiting longer than he expected. At first, he thought the moment would come quickly, that curiosity or temptation would reveal itself almost immediately. But as time passed, there was only silence. No sudden movement, no sign of urgency, nothing that suggested anything unusual had happened. That quiet began to unsettle him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't used to waiting without control, especially when he had set something in motion himself. Eventually, he found a reason to return to the study, keeping his steps measured, his expression neutral. To anyone watching, it would seem like a normal part of his routine, just another visit to check on something in his workspace. But internally, his attention was sharp, focused entirely on one detail. As he approached the door, he slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, his eyes moving immediately toward the safe. It was closed, not just left as he had placed it, slightly open, but fully shut, as if someone had taken the time to correct what he had left undone. He stopped where he stood, his gaze fixed on it for a second longer than usual. There was no visible sign of disturbance in the room. The desk was clean, the shelves undisturbed, everything in its place. If he hadn't known what he had done earlier, he might have assumed nothing had changed. But he knew. He walked closer, his movements slower now, more deliberate. His hand reached out, opening the safe again, this time with a different kind of focus. He looked inside, scanning the contents carefully. The cash was still there, stacked exactly as he had arranged it. The jewelry hadn't been moved. Nothing was missing. Nothing was even out of place. For a brief moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable, but something beneath that calm surface had shifted. This wasn't what he had expected. Not because he believed everyone would fail, but because experience had taught him to anticipate at least some level of compromise. A small change, a subtle sign, something that suggested the situation had been tested and adjusted. But there was nothing. The realization settled slowly, not all at once. He closed the safe again, this time with more awareness of the action itself. His mind began to replay the possibilities. She had entered the room. She had seen the safe. She had noticed what was inside. And then, instead of ignoring it or taking advantage of it, she had chosen to close it. Not to hide anything she had done, but to protect something that wasn't hers. That detail stayed with him. It wasn't just about what she didn't do. It was about what she chose to do instead. He turned slightly, his eyes moving around the room as if searching for something he had missed. But there was nothing else to find. The evidence wasn't in objects or changes. It was in the absence of both. In the quiet correction of a situation that could have gone differently. As he stood there, he felt a shift in his thinking, subtle but undeniable. The assumptions he had carried, the quiet judgments he made about people without fully knowing them, began to feel less certain. He had believed that character revealed itself under pressure, but he hadn't considered how quietly it could reveal itself in the absence of pressure, in a moment where no one was watching and nothing was expected. He stepped out of the study after a moment, closing the door behind him. His expression remained composed, but his thoughts were no longer the same. As he moved through the house, he noticed her again, not as part of the background, but as a person. She was continuing her work just as she always did, focused, steady, unaware of the impact of her choice. There was no sign that she expected anything in return, no glance in his direction that suggested she was waiting for acknowledgement. That, more than anything, held his attention. He paused briefly, watching her without interruption, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as an employee, not as a role, but as someone whose actions had quietly challenged everything he thought he understood about trust and integrity. The moment stayed with him long after it had passed, not because it was dramatic, but because of how quietly it unfolded. He had expected a result, something clear and easy to define, but what he received was something deeper, something that didn't rely on action alone, but on intention. As he went through the rest of his day, his thoughts kept returning to that closed safe, to the small, deliberate choice that had been made without any expectation of recognition. It began to reshape the way he understood trust. For years, he had treated trust as something conditional, something that needed to be tested, measured, and proven under the right circumstances. He believed that without pressure, without risk, a person's true nature remained hidden. But what he had witnessed challenged that idea. There had been no pressure in that moment, no threat, no consequence waiting on the other side. And yet, the choice made was clear, steady, and aligned with something internal rather than external. That realization forced him to reconsider the way he judged people. He had often relied on position, appearance, and past experience to form his opinions. He trusted those who had proven themselves in visible ways and remained cautious of those he didn't fully understand. But now, he saw a gap in that thinking. Character wasn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it existed quietly, in people who didn't seek attention or recognition, in those who simply did what was right without feeling the need to explain it. He thought about how easily he had overlooked her, how quickly he had placed her into a category without taking the time to truly see her. It wasn't intentional, but it was real, and that made the lesson harder to ignore. He had assumed that if someone had integrity, it would show in obvious ways, in actions that demanded acknowledgement. But her choice hadn't demanded anything. It had been simple, almost invisible, and yet it carried more weight than anything he had expected to witness. As the day went on, he found himself paying more attention to the details around him, not just in his environment, but in the people within it. He noticed how others carried out their responsibilities, how they responded when no one was directly watching, how they handled small decisions that didn't seem important on the surface. These were the moments he had overlooked before, dismissing them as routine or insignificant. Now, they felt meaningful. He began to understand that integrity wasn't something that appeared suddenly under extreme conditions. It was built over time, reflected in consistent behavior, in choices that seemed small but added up to something much larger. That shift in perspective didn't come with a dramatic realization or a sudden change in personality. It was quieter than that, more gradual, like something settling into place. He didn't feel the need to announce it or turn it into a lesson for others. Instead, it stayed with him internally, influencing the way he thought, the way he observed, and the way he interacted with those around him. He also recognized something about himself that he hadn't fully acknowledged before. His need to test people, to create situations where their character could be revealed, came from a place of caution, but also from a lack of trust. He had believed that without those tests, he couldn't be sure of who people really were. But now, he saw that trust didn't always need to be forced into existence through challenges. Sometimes, it could be built through attention, through understanding, through recognizing patterns that were already there. That didn't mean he would stop being careful or aware. It meant he would approach people differently, with a greater willingness to see them as individuals rather than assumptions. The experience didn't just change how he viewed others. It changed how he viewed the idea of value itself. He had always associated value with what could be measured, counted, or displayed. Money, assets, success, all things that had clear definitions and visible impact. But what he had witnessed couldn't be measured in the same way. It didn't increase his wealth or expand his business. Yet, it left a lasting impression that felt just as significant. It reminded him that some of the most important qualities a person can have aren't the ones that stand out immediately. They are the ones that remain consistent, even when there is no reason for them to be noticed.